They called him the King of New York, a man whose shipping empire moved more than cargo across dark waters. But that night at the Metropolitan Lounge, Mark D. Hendon didn't want negotiations. He wanted distraction. He stared at the trembling waitress who had just baptized his $3,000 charcoal suit in vintage Bordeaux and did something that made grown men's blood run cold. He smiled. The room held its breath. He gestured toward the empty stage where Manhattan's finest soprano should have been standing. "You ruined my evening," he said, his voice carrying the weight of a death sentence wrapped in silk. "So earn your survival. Sing the Queen of the Night aria. Right now. Flawlessly." His eyes glittered with cruel amusement. "Do that, and maybe I'll even marry you." He thought it was a joke. He thought he was watching a mouse in a trap. He had no idea he was staring at a ghost who'd been hiding in plain sight for 3 years. The storm that battered Manhattan that November night was biblical, turning the streets into rivers and the sky into something ancient and furious. Rain hammered against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Metropolitan Lounge, the kind of exclusive establishment that didn't advertise and didn't need to. To Wall Street, it was where titans closed billion-dollar deals over aged whiskey. To those who understood the city's real power structure, it was the demilitarized zone where New York's most dangerous players conducted business without bloodshed. Usually, Dana R. Morgan tugged at the high collar of her uniform, feeling the fabric chafe against skin that had forgotten what luxury felt like. She'd been invisible here for 8 months, just another face in black and white, pouring wine for men who moved markets and ended careers with text messages. She was 24, but her eyes carried decades. Her hands, elegant despite the roughness from her day job scrubbing hotel bathrooms in the Bronx, trembled slightly as she checked her station. The lounge hummed with controlled chaos tonight. The headline act, an internationally acclaimed soprano flown in from Vienna, was stranded at LaGuardia. The storm had seen to that. And when powerful men were denied their entertainment, the atmosphere turned from expensive to explosive. "Morgan. Table 7. Now." Marcus Chun, the floor manager, materialized at her elbow like a well-dressed executioner. His voice was barely above a whisper, but his face was slick with the particular terror reserved for those who served the unkillable. "The 2009 Chateau Margaux." And Dana, his fingers dug into her forearm. "Don't look at him. Don't speak unless spoken to. Mr. Hendon is in what his security team calls a mood." Dana's pulse turned to ice water in her veins. Everyone knew Mark D. Hendon. Not just knew of him, knew him the way sailors knew storms. At 34, he'd inherited his father's shipping conglomerate and tripled it within 5 years. His legitimate business stretched from Singapore to Sao Paulo. His illegitimate business was the subject of whispered speculation and FBI investigations that mysteriously evaporated. He had the face of old money, sharp jawline, eyes like frozen amber, and the reputation of something far older and far less forgiving. They said he'd stopped smiling the day his father died under suspicious circumstances. They said his rivals had a habit of disappearing. Tonight was supposed to be a celebration of some kind, a merger, a conquest, the usual choreographed dominance. The Metropolitan Lounge had arranged for Vienna's finest to perform a private recital. But now, with the soprano grounded and the storm raging, the city's most dangerous man sat at table 7 like a bored emperor watching Rome burn. Dana balanced the crystal decanter. The bottle alone cost more than her monthly rent, and moved through the candlelit space. The Metropolitan Lounge was all dark wood and darker secrets, the kind of place where every shadow seemed to hold a transaction or a threat. Table 7 occupied the prime corner, a semicircular booth elevated slightly above the main floor like a throne. Mark Hendon sat at its center, surrounded by men in suits that cost more than cars. But he was the sun they orbited, impossible to ignore. He wasn't looking at his associates or the rain-lashed windows. He was staring at nothing with the particular intensity of someone calculating the exact cost of disappointment. Dana approached with the practiced invisibility she'd perfected over months. Pour the wine. Retreat. Survive another night. That was the plan. She didn't see the designer briefcase jutting into the aisle. The moment unfolded with the terrible clarity of catastrophe. Her foot catching, her weight shifting, the decanter tilting. The 2009 Chateau Margaux, $4,000 of liquid velvet, arced through the air in a crimson ribbon and splashed across Mark D. Hendon's shoulder, his lapel, his chest. The entire lounge went silent. Not quiet, silent. 200 conversations died mid-syllable. Glasses stopped clinking. Even the storm seemed to pause to watch. Dana stood frozen, the empty decanter in her hand, watching burgundy wine soak into charcoal wool and knowing with absolute certainty that she was about to die. Mark Hendon looked down at his ruined suit. He touched the spreading stain with 2 fingers, brought them to his lips, and tasted the wine. Then, slowly, so slowly it felt like watching a predator decide whether to play with its food, he lifted his eyes to her face and smiled. It was the most terrifying thing Dana had ever seen. "Well," he said, his voice carrying through the silence like a judge reading a sentence. "This is unfortunate." He plucked a shard of broken glass from the table where the decanter's stopper had shattered, turned it over in his fingers, watching it catch the light. "You've ruined my evening, ruined my suit, and embarrassed me in front of colleagues who very much enjoy watching me lose control." He stood. He was tall, 6'2", maybe 6'3", and the room seemed to tilt toward him like gravity had shifted. "So here's what's going to happen." Mark gestured toward the small stage at the far end of the lounge, where a microphone stood like a gallows. "The singer we paid $50,000 for is trapped at an airport. But you," his smile widened, showing teeth, "you're going to fix this. You're going to walk up there, and you're going to sing the Queen of the Night aria. The whole thing. Every impossible note." Dana's mouth went dry. Around the room, she could feel the collective intake of breath, the way the other patrons leaned forward like Romans at the Colosseum. "If you succeed," Mark continued, his tone conversational but his eyes deadly serious, "I'll forgive the suit. Hell, I'll be so impressed I might even marry you. Make you the Queen of New York." Laughter rippled through his associates, cold, knowing laughter. "But if you fail," he let the pause stretch, let the implications sink in like venom. "If you embarrass me further by croaking through it like every other terrified amateur who thinks they can sing, then you disappear. Into my car. Into my world. And you'll learn what it means to truly ruin someone's evening." He sat back down, the gesture of a man who'd just moved a chess piece and knew the game was already over. "You have 60 seconds to decide. The clock starts now." Dana stood there, feeling 200 pairs of eyes boring into her skin. Her hands shook. Her throat closed. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to vanish into the storm, to never stop running. But something else was rising in her chest. Something she'd buried 3 years ago when they'd told her father's death was an accident, when the conservatory had stopped returning her calls, when she'd traded Verdi for vinegar water and dirty plates. Mark D. Hendon had just issued her a death sentence disguised as entertainment. He had no idea he'd just challenged the daughter of Luciano Morgan, the maestro whose final performance had ended on a ship very much like the ones in Mark's fleet. He had no idea that the Queen of the Night aria wasn't just notes on a page for her. It was a weapon she'd been forged to wield. Dana set down the empty decanter. She smoothed her uniform with hands that had stopped trembling. And then, in a voice that surprised even herself with its steadiness, she said, "I'll need the microphone adjusted. And someone should warn your guests to cover their glasses." Mark's eyebrow lifted a fraction. "Why?" Dana met his eyes for the first time, really met them, and saw the exact moment he realized she wasn't what he'd assumed. "Because I don't do anything halfway, Mr. Hendon. And when I sing, things tend to shatter." She turned and walked toward the stage, her heartbeat a war drum, her father's voice echoing in her memory. "Your voice is power, Dana. Never forget that. Never hide it." Behind her, Mark D. Hendon leaned forward in his seat, suddenly very interested in the waitress he'd thought was a lamb. He was about to learn she was something far more dangerous. She was a phoenix who'd been playing dead. "If you're listening right now, help me prove something wrong. My mother said I wouldn't even reach 2,000 subscribers, but I believe stories like this deserve to be heard. Help me show her that these tales matter. Please subscribe. Now let's continue." Dana climbed the 3 steps to the stage with the steady gait of someone walking toward execution or coronation. At this point, the distinction hardly mattered. The microphone stand gleamed under the spotlight like a silver guillotine. She adjusted it with practiced precision, her fingers remembering rituals her conscious mind had tried to forget. Behind her, the Metropolitan Lounge held its collective breath, 200 predators waiting to watch something beautiful get destroyed. Mark Hendon sat forward in his seat, elbows on the table, hands clasped like a man at prayer or a judge awaiting entertainment. His ruined suit was already forgotten. This was better than any soprano from Vienna. This was a blood sport. Dana closed her eyes. She could feel her father's hands on her shoulders from 3 years ago, adjusting her posture in the conservatory's practice room. Breathe from your core, Piccola. Let them feel the lightning before they hear the thunder. The memory should have broken her. Instead, it forged something cold and sharp in her chest. She opened her mouth, and the first note detonated. It wasn't singing. It was a declaration of war. The opening phrase of the Queen of the Night aria cut through the room like a blade through silk, crystal clear, impossibly high, and so precise it felt surgical. Dana's voice climbed the treacherous coloratura passages that ended careers, each note a separate act of defiance. The infamous F6, the note that made professionals weep, rang out like a bell forged in heaven and tempered in hell. The room didn't just go silent. It went still. A wine glass on table 3 began to vibrate. The antique chandelier above the bar hummed in sympathetic resonance. Dana's voice filled every corner, every shadow, claiming the space with a ferocity that made the storm outside sound apologetic. Mark's hands unclenched slowly. His expression shifted from amused cruelty to something else entirely. Recognition, perhaps, or the dawning realization that he'd just awakened something that should have stayed sleeping. Around him, his associates had stopped pretending to look bored. They stared at the waitress on stage the way men stared at incoming missiles. Dana held the final, impossible high note. Held it longer than humanly reasonable. Held it until the chandelier's crystals sang, and a champagne flute at table 7 cracked down its center with a sound like a gunshot. Only then did she release it, letting the silence rush back in like floodwater. For 3 heartbeats, no one moved. Then Mark D. Hendon began to clap. Slowly. Each strike of his palms against each other was a calculated provocation. The room exploded into applause, nervous, thunderous, confused applause from people who'd just witnessed something they didn't have language for. Dana stood at the microphone, chest heaving, and met Mark's eyes across the distance. He was smiling again, but this smile was different. Dangerous in a new way. He stood, buttoning his ruined jacket with the casualness of a king adjusting his crown. When he spoke, his voice carried despite the applause. It seems I have a wedding to plan. The room erupted into laughter, darker now knowing. Dana's hands curled into fists at her sides. She'd just stopped being invisible. And in Mark Hendon's world, visibility was the most dangerous thing you could be. Mark's private office occupied the entire top floor of the building, accessible only by a key-card elevator that required both a code and a fingerprint. Dana stood in front of his desk 20 minutes later, still wearing her wine-stained uniform, while he poured himself a scotch that probably cost more than her annual salary. The city sprawled below them through floor-to-ceiling windows, a kingdom of lights drowning in rain. "Sit," Mark said, not looking at her. "I'd rather stand." That made him glance up, one eyebrow raised with something that might have been respect or might have been the prelude to violence. "Most people who enter this room are desperate to please me. Most people in this room probably aren't wondering if you killed their father." The words left her mouth before her survival instincts could stop them. Mark went very still, the scotch glass frozen halfway to his lips. When he finally moved, it was to set the glass down with careful precision and lean back in his chair, studying her with the focus of a man reappraising a weapon he'd underestimated. "Luciano Morgan," he said quietly. "The maestro. Died 3 years ago in a warehouse fire near the Red Hook shipping terminals." His eyes narrowed. "You're his daughter." It wasn't a question. Dana's throat tightened, but she refused to look away. "The marriage joke ends here," she said, her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her ribs. "I'm not interested in being your trophy or your punchline. But you have resources I don't. Information I can't access." She took a breath that tasted like surrender and rebellion in equal measure. "I want a deal." Mark's smile was slow, predatory. "I'm listening. Protection. Access to your network. And the name of whoever orchestrated my father's murder." Dana stepped closer to the desk, her exhaustion transforming into something sharper. "In exchange, I'll be whatever you need me to be. A singer at your events. A distraction at your meetings. A ghost in rooms where you need someone invisible who can hear everything." Why would I agree to that? Because you just watched me do the impossible in front of the city's most powerful players, and now they're all wondering who I am and why you're keeping me. Dana leaned forward, palms flat on his desk. "Because I just became a liability if I walk out of here, and an asset if I stay. And because," her voice dropped to something raw and honest, "because you know what it's like to lose a father and spend years wondering who to blame." The silence stretched between them like a wire pulled taut. Outside, lightning fractured the sky. Mark stood, moving around the desk until he was close enough that she could smell expensive cologne and the ghost of spilled wine. He extended his hand. 6 months, he said. You stay close, you sing when I tell you to sing, and you don't ask questions about anything else you see. In exchange, I'll find out who killed Luciano Morgan. His grip tightened when she took his hand. But understand this, Dana. The moment you learn that name, you become the most dangerous person in New York. And I won't protect my liabilities forever. Dana met his eyes, feeling the trap and the lifeline braided together in his words. Then I guess we both have 6 months to decide what I am. She shook his hand, sealing a bargain with the devil. Neither of them knew the clock had already started counting down. The penthouse suite Mark provided overlooked Central Park, all marble and minimalism, and the kind of silence only serious money could buy. Dana had been living there for 2 weeks when the garment bag arrived, delivered by a woman whose entire demeanor screamed discretion and astronomical hourly rates. The gown inside was the color of fresh blood, silk so fine it seemed to breathe, cut in a way that would transform her from invisible waitress to lethal accessory. Mark arrived an hour before the Met Gala, dressed in a tuxedo that made him look less like a shipping magnate and more like a beautiful weapon in formal wear. He stopped in the doorway when he saw her, and for 3 seconds something unguarded flickered across his face before the mask slammed back into place. You'll do, he said, voice carefully neutral. Dana adjusted the diamond choker at her throat, borrowed, like everything else about this new life. We should establish rules. Rules. Mark crossed to the bar, poured 2 glasses of champagne without asking if she wanted one. I wasn't aware you were in a position to make demands. Business only, Dana said, accepting the glass but not drinking. Whatever this looks like tonight, whatever people assume, it's transactional. You get your information. I get mine. Nobody forgets why we're doing this. Mark's smile was sharp enough to draw blood. Worried you might start enjoying playing Cinderella? Worried you might forget I'm not actually yours to command. She met his eyes over the rim of her glass. The performance at the lounge was survival. Everything after that is a negotiation. He moved closer, invading her space with the casual confidence of someone who'd never learned to fear consequences. His hand came up to adjust the choker, fingers brushing her collarbone with deliberate slowness. You're nervous. I'm smart enough to be nervous. Dana's pulse kicked against her throat, and she knew he could feel it. Victor Sterling will be there tonight. The man you think might have killed my father. I don't think so. I know. Mark's thumb traced the edge of the diamonds. Sterling owns half the art world and uses gallery shipments to move things that aren't art. Your father was writing a profile on cultural trafficking for the Times before he died. He got too close to something Sterling needed buried. The room tilted. Dana set down her champagne before she could drop it. Why didn't you tell me this before? Because you needed to want this for the right reasons. Mark stepped back, and the absence of his proximity felt like a physical loss, which terrified her more than anything else tonight. Sterling will recognize you. You look too much like Luciano. When he does, you smile like you don't care, and you let me handle the rest. And if I can't, then we both find out how good you are at improvising. He offered his arm, the gesture almost courtly except for the danger in his eyes. Rule established, Dana. Business only. But we're about to walk into a room full of the city's most perceptive predators, and they'll smell fear or hesitation from a mile away. His voice dropped to something almost intimate. So whatever you're feeling right now, the anger, the fear, this. He gestured between them at the charged air that crackled like a live wire. You bury it deep, and you play the part like your life depends on it. Because it does. Because it does, he agreed. Dana took his arm, feeling the coiled strength beneath the elegant fabric, and together they walked toward the elevator. Behind them, the blood-red gown trailed like a warning, and the city below glittered with all the cold promise of a beautiful trap about to spring shut. The Met Gala transformed the museum into something between a palace and a hunting ground. Beneath vaulted ceilings and Renaissance masterpieces, New York's elite circulated in their armor of couture and old money, conducting wars with smiles and champagne flutes. Dana moved through it all on Mark's arm, hyper-aware of every gaze that lingered a fraction too long, every conversation that died as they passed. Mark navigated the room like a shark through bloody water, efficient, predatory, missing nothing. His hand rested at the small of her back, a gesture that appeared possessive but felt more like a handler keeping a weapon primed. They'd been there 20 minutes when Dana felt it. the particular quality of attention that separated curious observation from recognition. Victor Sterling stood across the gallery, framed by a Caravaggio that seemed appropriate for a man who dealt in beautiful violence. He was older than she'd expected, mid-50s, with silver hair styled like money and a smile that had probably closed billion-dollar deals and buried inconvenient truths in equal measure. He wore his tuxedo the way conquerors wore crowns, and he was staring directly at Dana with the focused intensity of someone solving a puzzle. "He's seen you," Mark murmured against her ear, his breath warm enough to send electricity down her spine. "Remember the rules." Sterling began moving toward them through the crowd, and Dana watched him come with the detached clarity of prey, watching a predator decide whether to strike. Mark's hand tightened fractionally at her back, reassurance or warning, she couldn't tell. "Hendon," Sterling said when he reached them, his voice cultured and smooth as aged whiskey. "I heard rumors you'd found yourself a songbird. The performance at the Metropolitan Lounge is already legendary." His eyes never left Dana's face. "Though I must say, seeing her in person is quite striking." "Dana Morgan," Mark said, his tone bored but his body radiating controlled violence. "My fiancé." The word landed like a grenade in civil conversation. Dana forced herself to smile, to extend her hand, to play the part even as Sterling's fingers closed around hers with just slightly too much pressure. "Morgan," Sterling repeated, tasting the name like wine. His smile widened, showing too many teeth. "You know, there was a journalist years ago. Luciano Morgan. Brilliant man. Tragic what happened." He tilted his head, studying her with the clinical interest of an entomologist examining a pinned butterfly. "The resemblance is quite remarkable. Are you related?" The gallery seemed to contract around them. Dana felt Mark's fingers press once against her spine. A warning, a reminder, a lifeline. "He was my father," she said, and her voice didn't shake even though her entire world was narrowing to the predator's smile in front of her. "Was," Sterling echoed softly, and something cold and satisfied flickered in his eyes. "Yes. The warehouse fire, wasn't it? Such a terrible accident." He released her hand, but his gaze pinned her like a specimen. "He was quite the martyr for truth, your father. Asked too many questions about things that didn't concern him. Poked around shipments and manifests that were, shall we say, artistically licensed." "Careful, Sterling," Mark said, his voice dropping to something sub-zero. "You're making my fiancé uncomfortable." Sterling's laugh was elegant and utterly devoid of warmth. "My apologies. I simply find it fascinating when ghosts resurface." He looked between them, and Dana saw the exact moment he decided they were a threat worth eliminating. "You make such a striking couple. I do hope nothing tragic interrupts your happiness the way tragedy seems to follow the Morgan name." He walked away, leaving the threat hanging in the air like smoke from an extinguished candle. Dana's legs felt like water, but Mark's hand kept her upright, kept her standing even as the room spun. "He just confessed," she whispered. "He just declared war," Mark corrected, already scanning the crowd for exits and threats. "And we're leaving. Now." They made it as far as the museum steps before the world exploded into violence. The motorcycles came from nowhere, 3 of them screaming out of the rain-slicked darkness with their headlights killed. Dana heard the engines before she saw them, a predatory growl that made Mark shove her behind him with brutal efficiency. The first gunshot shattered a marble column 6 inches from her head, and then chaos consumed everything. Mark had a gun in his hand faster than thought, returning fire as he dragged Dana down the steps toward the waiting town car. His security team materialized from the shadows, black suits moving with military precision, but the attackers had numbers and the element of shock. Gala attendees screamed and scattered like startled birds, their elegant evening dissolving into primal terror. "Get to the car." Mark's voice cut through the gunfire, sharp as broken glass. Dana ran, her blood-red gown tangling around her legs, expensive heels abandoned on marble as bullets sparked off stone. She could hear Mark behind her, covering her retreat with methodical shots that suggested this wasn't his first firefight. She was 10 feet from the town car when the second wave hit. 2 motorcycles cut off their escape route, riders in black helmets raising weapons with professional calm. Dana froze, calculations racing through her head. Too far to run back, nowhere to hide, Mark still 20 feet behind her dealing with the first assault. She was going to die on museum steps in borrowed diamonds, while New York's elite watched from the safety of Renaissance galleries. Then Mark slammed into her from behind, his body becoming a shield as the bullets came. She felt the impact through him, once, twice, felt his sharp intake of breath, and the way his weight suddenly became dead mass, driving them both to the ground. They hit the wet pavement hard, Mark twisting at the last second, so he took the brunt of it, his arms locked around her even as blood bloomed across his white shirt. "Stay down," he gasped against her ear, and she could hear the pain threaded through command. His remaining security team returned fire with prejudice, and the motorcycles scattered like cockroaches in sudden light. Engines screamed into the night, leaving behind only cordite smoke and the wail of approaching sirens. Mark's driver appeared, a granite-faced man who hauled them both into the car with economical violence. And then they were moving, tires shrieking as they fled into the rain-drenched labyrinth of Manhattan. Dana pressed her hands against Mark's side, feeling a hot blood pulse between her fingers. His face had gone pale, jaw clenched against pain, but his eyes stayed sharp and calculating even as his body betrayed him. "How bad?" she demanded, her voice steadier than she felt. "Bad enough that Sterling just escalated from warning to execution." Mark's laugh was wet and bitter. "Good enough that I'm still alive to be angry about it." He fumbled with his phone, fingers leaving crimson smears on the screen. "Safe house in Montauk. 2 hours if we're lucky, forever if Sterling has people on the highways. You need a hospital. I need you to keep pressure on that wound and trust that I've survived worse." His hand found hers where it pressed against his ribs, holding it there with surprising strength. "Welcome to my world, Dana. Still think the deal was worth it?" She looked at him. This man who'd shielded her body with his own, who was bleeding because she'd insisted on answers, who'd just proven that whatever this arrangement was, it had stopped being purely transactional the moment he'd stepped between her and bullets. "Ask me again when we're not running for our lives," she said, pressing harder against the wound as the city blurred past them into darkness. The safe house was more bunker than beach cottage, all reinforced concrete and bulletproof glass masquerading as weathered Hampton's charm. Dawn was breaking over the Atlantic when Dana finally got Mark onto the surgical steel table in what passed for a medical bay, complete with equipment that suggested this wasn't the first time someone had needed emergency field surgery here. "You're going to have to do it," Mark said through gritted teeth, his shirt cut away to reveal 2 entry wounds, one a graze along his ribs, the other buried deep in his shoulder. "Medical kit in the cabinet. I'll talk you through it." Dana's hands shook as she assembled supplies, sutures, antiseptic, forceps that looked like instruments of torture. "I sing opera. I don't perform surgery. You perform the impossible on a regular basis. This is just a different stage." Mark's attempt at humor died as she poured antiseptic over the wounds. His curse was creative and multilingual. She worked with the same focused precision she brought to the Queen of the Night's coloratura passages, following Mark's terse instructions as she extracted the bullet fragment and stitched damaged tissue. His breathing stayed controlled despite the pain, and she realized this man had endured worse without anesthesia, probably more than once. "Your father," Mark said suddenly, his voice rough with pain and something else, "wasn't just investigating Sterling. He was going to testify." Dana's hands paused mid-suture. "Federal case. Human trafficking disguised as art shipments. Sterling moves people the way I move legitimate cargo. Hidden in containers, manifested as sculpture or antique furniture. Women, mostly. Children." His eyes met hers, and the naked fury there stole her breath. Luciano had documentation. Names, routes, shipping manifests that proved the whole operation. He was supposed to meet with prosecutors the day after he died. The needle trembled in Dana's grip. "The warehouse fire. Was Sterling cleaning the house? Your father and every piece of evidence burned together." Mark's jaw clenched as she resumed stitching. "I didn't know Luciano personally, but I knew of him. Everyone in shipping did. He was trying to expose something that would have brought down half the art world's elite and several very powerful families. Why didn't you tell me this before?" Dana tied off the final suture with more force than necessary. "Because knowing makes you a target. Because the moment you understand the scope of what Sterling's protecting, you become as dangerous as your father was." Mark caught her wrist, his grip weak but insistent. "He didn't just die, Dana. He was executed for trying to save people Sterling treats as merchandise. And now Sterling knows you exist, knows you're asking questions, knows you're with me. So I'm already dead. So you're already committed." Mark pulled himself upright despite the fresh agony it caused, his face inches from hers. "Your father died fighting a monster. The question is whether you're brave enough to finish what he started, or smart enough to walk away while you still can." Dana looked at the blood on her hands, his blood, spilled protecting her from bullets, meant to silence her the way they'd silenced Luciano. She thought of her father's voice, his final article unfinished, the people still trapped in Sterling's network, while the city's elite sipped champagne and pretended not to see. "I'm my father's daughter," she said quietly. Walking away was never an option. Mark's smile was equal parts pride and resignation. Then we're both dead. Might as well make it count. Outside, the ocean crashed against the shore like applause or artillery, and the rising sun painted everything the color of blood and gold. The Constellation was a floating palace of steel and sin, Sterling's private cruise liner that officially hosted charity galas and unofficially moved human cargo across international waters, where laws became suggestions and morality drowned in the wake. Mark had spent 3 days building their infiltration plan, his shoulders still bandaged but his mind sharp as the blade he'd strapped to Dana's thigh beneath her cocktail dress. They came aboard as investors for Sterling's latest philanthropic venture, an art restoration fund that was really a money laundering operation with excellent PR. Mark's lawyer, Richard Castellano, had arranged the introduction, vouching for them with the kind of credibility that opened doors even paranoia kept locked. Dana played the part of the elegant companion, her voice a known commodity now after the Met Gala incident went viral among New York's elite. Sterling's keeping the manifests in his private office below deck, Mark murmured as they circulated through the upper salon, champagne flutes serving as props. "Third level, past the engine room. We have 20 minutes before the dinner service when security rotates." They moved through the ship like ghosts, Mark's knowledge of maritime layouts guiding them through service corridors and crew passages that smelled of oil and salt. Dana's heart hammered against her ribs, each step taking them deeper into Sterling's domain where help couldn't reach and screams wouldn't carry. The office was exactly where Castellano had said it would be, behind a door marked private in 3 languages. Mark picked the lock with practiced efficiency while Dana stood watch, every nerve screaming that this felt too easy, too clean, too much like a trap waiting to spring. The manifests were there. Shipping containers labeled as antiquities and restoration materials, with human names penciled in margins. Anya, 19, Sophia, 16, names that represented lives Sterling treated as inventory. Dana photographed everything with shaking hands while Mark downloaded files onto an encrypted drive. "Well done, Hendon." They both spun toward Sterling's voice. He stood in the doorway with 6 armed men, and Richard Castellano beside him wearing gilt like an ill-fitting suit. "Richard," Mark said, his voice dead calm even as Dana felt the world tilt sideways. "Disappointing." "Expensive," Castellano corrected miserably. "Sterling offered more than you could afford." "I'm sorry, Mark." "Truly. Sorry doesn't resurrect dead clients," Sterling said, stepping into the office with the confidence of a man who'd already won. "Take them to the cargo hold. The one on Manifest 23. His smile was a predator's promise. "I want them to see the merchandise before we discuss the terms of their permanent silence." They were dragged through corridors that grew progressively darker and colder, down to the ship's belly where the ocean's roar became something primordial and terrifying. The cargo hold was a converted container, reinforced walls, a single bulb casting nightmare shadows, and 20 pairs of eyes staring from makeshift bunks. Women and girls, some barely teenagers, watched Dana and Mark with the hollow expressions of people who'd stopped hoping for rescue. Sterling's men shoved them inside and locked the door with the finality of a coffin ceiling. Mark immediately went to work checking for structural weaknesses while Dana approached the nearest woman. 30s, bruises mapping recent violence across her arms. "How long have you been here?" Dana whispered. "Long enough to know no one leaves this ship alive," the woman replied in accented English. "Sterling doesn't leave witnesses. He doesn't leave evidence." Her eyes held the kind of knowledge that came from watching others die. "You're just the latest cargo. Just newer packaging for the same destination." Mark's hand found Dana's in the darkness, his grip steady despite the tremor in her own. "Then we'd better figure out how to make some noise," he said quietly, and Dana understood with sudden, crystalline clarity that her voice was about to become more than art. It was about to become their only weapon against annihilation. Sterling arrived 2 hours later with the theatrical timing of a man who understood the drama's value. He had a portable speaker system wheeled in, complete with a wireless microphone, the entire setup absurdly professional for what was essentially a death sentence with production values. "I've been thinking about your performance at the Metropolitan Lounge," Sterling said, circling them like a shark sampling prey. Such raw talent was wasted on survival. Such power squandered on fear. He held out the microphone to Dana like a communion wafer laced with poison. Your father died before I could fully appreciate his integrity. But you get to sing one final time before joining him. Consider it a professional courtesy. Mark's hand tightened on Dana's, a silent message she felt in her bones. Trust yourself, trust this, trust that your voice is more than beauty. Dana took the microphone with steady fingers, her mind racing through calculations her conservatory training had never covered. The cargo hold was all metal and concrete, a perfect acoustic chamber. The speaker system was commercial grade, the kind with sensitive feedback loops if you knew how to exploit them. And Sterling, arrogant in his certainty, had given her the one weapon that could turn sound into force. "Any requests?" she asked, her voice carrying that peculiar calm that came before battle or performance. Sometimes the same thing. "Surprise me," Sterling said, settling onto a crate with his guards flanking him. Guns trained on Mark and the women huddled in shadows. "Make it memorable." Dana closed her eyes and thought of her father burning alive while trying to save people like these. Thought of Mark taking bullets meant for her. Though her training had taught her to access, the lyric soprano for beauty, the dramatic for power, and beneath it all, the primal scream that existed before music had rules. She started with the Queen of the Night, that impossible aria, but this time she wasn't performing. She was weaponizing. Her voice climbed to the stratospheric F6 and held it, then pushed further, into frequencies that made the guards wince. She moved closer to the speaker, angling the microphone with precision learned from 1,000 rehearsals, finding the exact position where feedback began to howl. Then she screamed. Not a musical note, but a sonic attack. Her trained diaphragm and decades of technique channeling pure force through the microphone. The feedback loop caught it, amplified it, turned it into a wall of sound that physically hit like a shockwave. The speaker system shrieked in sympathetic resonance, frequencies colliding and multiplying until the cargo hold became a torture chamber of noise. Guards dropped their weapons to clutch their ears. Sterling staggered backward, his face contorted in agony. The metal walls amplified everything, creating standing waves that shook loose bolts and made eardrums bleed. Mark moved before the sound even faded, his injured shoulder forgotten as he grabbed a dropped gun and put Sterling's nearest guard down with brutal efficiency. Dana held the note until her lungs burned, until the speaker system began to smoke, until every armed man in the hold was on his knees. Only then did she release it, the silence that followed more deafening than the assault. Mark had Sterling by the throat against the wall, the gun pressed under his chin. "You wanted a performance," Mark said, his voice barely controlled fury. "She just gave you a requiem." Sterling's eyes were wide with something that might have been fear, or might have been reluctant admiration. Blood trickled from his ears. "You can't kill me. There are others. The network is bigger than." "I don't need to kill you," Mark interrupted. "I just need to make sure you understand what happens to men who traffic in human misery." He glanced at Dana, at the women emerging from shadows, at the smoking wreckage of Sterling's confidence. "We're taking these people off your ship. We're taking your manifests to every federal agency that still believes in justice. And you're going to stand trial as the coward you are." Dana lowered the microphone, her hands shaking with adrenaline and spent fury. Around them, the women were moving, hope kindling in eyes that had forgotten its shape. Her voice had just stopped being an instrument. It had become justice singing in a register only the damned could hear. Sterling made his final mistake 3 minutes later. As federal agents stormed the ship, summoned by Mark's encrypted distress signal sent during the chaos, he reached for the gun at his ankle with the desperate speed of a cornered animal. Mark's shot was instinctive, clean, and final. Sterling crumpled against the cargo hold wall, his silver hair matted with blood that looked black in the dim light, his eyes holding the surprise of a man who'd never believed consequences applied to him. "Self-defense," Mark said flatly as agents swarmed the hold, as paramedics rushed to the traumatized women, as the machinery of justice finally, belatedly ground into motion. He met Dana's eyes across Sterling's corpse, and she saw no regret there. Only the cold satisfaction of a man who'd just removed a cancer from the world. The investigation took 3 months. Mark's lawyers, new ones, vetted ones, navigated the labyrinth of federal testimony while Dana watched her father's final article finally get published posthumously, Luciano Morgan's name cleared and elevated to martyr status in journalism circles. The trafficking network collapsed like dominoes, Sterling's associates scrambling to cut deals and save themselves from the prison sentences that awaited. Dana spent those months rediscovering her voice in Mark's penthouse, but this time without terror driving each note. She sang for the women they'd rescued, for the memory of her father, for the girl she'd been before survival had required invisibility. And she sang for Mark, who listened like a man learning to hear music for the first time. 6 months after the constellation, the Metropolitan Opera House glittered under November stars. The same storm that had brought them together seemed to bless their union. Rain hammering the Lincoln Center Plaza while inside, New York's elite gathered for something that had started as a cruel joke and transformed into the most anticipated debut of the season. Dana stood in the wings wearing white instead of blood red. The wedding ceremony conducted that morning in the same courthouse where Sterling's empire had been legally dismantled. The ring on her finger was platinum and sapphires, Mark's choice, because diamonds reminded them both of borrowed armor and near-death experiences. Nervous, Mark appeared beside her, devastating informal tales, his shoulder fully healed but carrying scars they both wore like medals. Terrified, Dana admitted. This is different from singing to survive. This is singing because you chose to. He kissed her temple, the gesture intimate and unhurried. The waitress is dead, Dana. The ghost is gone. What walks on that stage tonight is a queen who earned her throne through fire. The orchestra's opening notes swelled, calling her to destiny. Dana stepped into the light. Not as Luciano Morgan's daughter seeking revenge, not as Mark Hendon's weapon disguised as a companion, but as herself. Dana Morgan Hendon, soprano, survivor, the woman who'd turned her voice into a weapon and then back into art. The aria she performed wasn't the queen of the night. It was Pace, Pace, mio Dio from La Forza del Destino, a prayer for peace after violence, for grace after vengeance, for love discovered in the darkest waters. Her voice filled the opera house with the kind of power that came from understanding exactly how fragile and how fierce life could be. Mark watched from the private box, surrounded by the city's elite who'd witnessed her transformation from invisible servant to undeniable force. His expression held the particular pride of a man who'd bet on lightning and won everything. When the final note faded and the opera house exploded into standing ovation, Dana found his eyes across the distance. He pressed his hand over his heart, the heart she'd helped stitch back together, the heart that had learned to beat in harmony with hers. She'd come to New York to disappear. She'd found her voice instead. And in the process of seeking justice for a murdered father, she'd discovered something more dangerous and more beautiful than revenge. She'd discovered that some performances weren't about survival. They were about finally, triumphantly, impossibly coming home. Thank you for watching this story to the end. If you enjoyed this story, you will surely love the next one. It's as crazier and more intriguing as I can ever imagine. So do check it out. Click on the image showing on your screen right now to watch the next one. Please don't forget to subscribe.